how is funeral trust different than, say, final expense policies or pre-need plans done at funeral homes? So obviously, Mike, if you could handle the first question there.
Well, the pre-need, where many agents don't understand, is that when it comes to Medicaid planning or applying for Medicaid in most states, any life insurance over the face value of $1,500 can be a countable asset before Medicaid. And so what would happen in that case, they would spend down their assets thinking that that pre-need, not the pre-need, but the final expense plan is going to be Medicaid exempt. And the family doesn't realize, because it's over $1,500, any cash value in that policy could become a countable asset before Medicaid, and we would be forced to cash the policy out and take the cash value and spend it down until we get down to Medicaid eligibility. So families do not realize the importance of the funeral trust, and again, the final expense insurance, therefore, could be a countable asset, where the funeral trust is an exempt asset. And here's the big part of the funeral trust, is in most trusts today, we realize that we've gone from a 3-year look back to a 5-year look back, meaning that if we set up a trust today, we have to get past 5 years in order for those assets inside the trust to be Medicaid exempt, especially pertaining to irrevocable trusts. The neat thing about the funeral trust today is that the funeral trust is not subject to the 5-year look back, and therefore we can even go into a nursing home, assist our clients in setting up the funeral trust, and have it Medicaid exempt immediately.
Thanks, Mike. Well, that brings up a good point then to the question for Darren. And so, if final expense insurance is not Medicaid exempt, like a funeral trust is, the only other Medicaid exempt plan would be a prepaid funeral plan done at a funeral home, correct, Darren?
That's correct. What I like to educate people on is the difference between the two trusts, or the difference between a funeral plan and our trust. So let's first look at a funeral home plan. People first have to go to a funeral home, and as we all know, they don't want to do that. That is the last thing that they'll probably want to do. When they go to a funeral home, they have to pick out 3 different aspects of a funeral, and they have to pick those aspects out. And the first is the service, the type of service they want. Secondly, they pick out merchandise, such as a casket, a vault, urns, things like that. And the third part is cash advances. Cash advances would be things like obituaries, flowers, clergy, cemetery opening and closing. Now, when they go to the funeral home, a cost is determined for those 3 items that they pick out, and the family pays the funeral home that estimated cost. Now, here's where we're different. The funeral home takes their money and they own it. They invest it, they keep all the interest, they keep all the commissions, and in a lot of cases, they'll make themselves beneficiaries if it's an insurance policy. So why would you want to make a beneficiary of the funeral home and not a loved one? Another problem that at the funeral homes, and how we're a little bit different, is the funeral home, and many families will say this to you, the funeral home will guarantee my prices. They'll guarantee the price of this funeral for years, and that is true to an extent, but is not totally true. The cash advanced items I talked about earlier, the cemetery, flowers, the clergy, and all that, that is not a guaranteed item on a funeral contract. So what happens is, when they die, they may owe significant amounts of money if the cash advanced items went up. So that's not a good thing for the for the client, because accounts at funeral homes are making 1%, and some are paying 0% this year. So what does that mean? That as the cash advances go up, the families are going to owe a significant amount of money. And let's not also overlook, which I talk about a lot, is that funeral homes have misappropriated $750 million in funerals. So that means families went in and prepaid that funeral, and they think everything's done, and when someone dies, they go to the funeral home and they have to come up with a significant amount of money. So our program is so much better because the families can put the money aside for their funeral into the funeral trust, and then at the time of death, they can go to any funeral home they like to. So they're not worried if the funeral home goes out of business or has misappropriated their money. The second biggest thing is they control their spending, and that's what I bring up a lot with my families. When you go to the funeral home with a funeral trust, you have a budget of money that you will use to spend on that funeral. And it's portable to any funeral home, so if they move, it's not a problem. It's flexible. They're not locked into that funeral home merchandise or their service. Because I've had clients who have prearranged their funeral, and 20 years later they die, and the family decides, oh, we're just going to do something real simple. Well, as a funeral director, I'm happy because I get to keep all their money. But in our situation, as you know, all that extra money will be returned to the estate, or depending on the trust, could go to a beneficiary. So that's how we're different. It's just a safer way to accomplish the same thing, but it's safer for the families, and it's not locking your money into a funeral home. And one of the things I always ask family, I said, when you invest your money, where do you go to invest your money? With a financial planner or someone you trust, not to a funeral home. A funeral home, you don't think of investing your money in a funeral home, but that's really what you're doing when you give them that money. So I say to them, you don't want to invest in the funeral homes. They are not the best place to do it, and we can accomplish the same thing, but even safer with our program.
I think also, Darren, what's important too is that most people don't want to go to the funeral home to begin with, because picking out a casket and those types of things are so final. And there was a report that was written a couple of years ago that Darren shared with me that said that 90% of seniors over the age of 65 feel that doing their funeral planning was very important, but over 70% of them said that they did not want to do it at the funeral home, but would rather do it with their trusted financial advisor. So again, you're going to find that the people are much more comfortable coming into your office, sitting down from an estate planning point of view, funding their trust, knowing it doesn't go through probate, that the money's going to be there, even if they end up on Medicaid and have to do the spend down, that money in the funeral trust is going to be there to provide their final expenses when they do pass on. Yeah. And I think too, as Darren mentioned, it gives the family the portability and the flexibility to choose whatever funeral home is in business at the time of the loved one.
And I like to say, Mike brought up the casket. That's a wonderful example of how funeral home pre-need doesn't work. I've had people come in and buy a casket from me on a pre-need basis for, an average casket in the United States is around $2,800 to $3,000. The thing about caskets is the prices are going down. So you're really giving a funeral home $3,000 so they can invest and buy that casket when you die, and the prices are actually going down because there's more competition and people can buy caskets from other places. They're shipping them in from China, things like that. So your trust won't lock you into that $3,000 casket at the time of need. Your family can go anywhere and buy a casket, and that's one of the things we want to make sure people understand, that you don't have to go to a funeral home to buy a casket. You can buy it at the time of need and possibly save 50% of your cost on a casket by buying it from another resource and not necessarily a funeral home, and that money can be kept in the family. And that's just one of the things that we like to stress with people, and so they understand that sometimes it's not good to pre-select those items and have that funeral home have your money. It just doesn't make sense when you can have all your planning done on your own without having to go to a funeral home.